Hello and welcome to Artifacts, a living archive dedicated to preserving the first-person stories of queer, avant-garde, and underground culture, told by those who lived it. Today's conversation is part of Spaces, a new artifact series exploring the locations where avant-garde history took place, tracing the buildings and communities that shaped cultural revolutions. To celebrate the release of our new Artifacts film with John Giorno, we partnered with Giorno Poetry Systems to host an event at 222 Bowery, one of New York's most storied addresses. From 1885 to 1932, it was a YMCA and then evolved into an unlikely creative hub, home to artists such as Fernand Léger, Mark Rothko, Linda Benglis, and Wynne Chamberlain, a painter and writer who was an early collaborator of Andy Warhol and a forthcoming subject on artifacts. John Giorno lived in the building from 1966, transforming his loft into a studio, performance space, and the headquarters for his groundbreaking Dial-A-Poem poetry project. In the 1970s, William Burroughs took over the building's former locker room, a space that became known as the Bunker, now legendary within both beat and punk circles. Recorded inside the Bunker itself, in this episode, you'll hear a conversation with me, Stephen Watson, and Ira Silverberg. Ira was an editor at Grove Press, publisher at Serpent's Tail, and a longtime advocate for the underground press. Silverberg, who lived in the Bunker with his partner James Grauerholtz, offers an intimate perspective on Burroughs, Giorno, and the creative life that thrived within the walls of 222 Bowery. Since we're partly dealing with a sense of space and neighborhood, I would love to hear you talk about what this neighborhood was when you came here. Because, everything has been so gentrified that it's in some ways hard to imagine a not gentrified area of New York.
Below Houston was even worse than above Houston on the Bowery. I mean, I in high school, I had a boyfriend who lived on the Bowery, and first Howie Montauk, who was the doorman at Hurrah then. So, the famous Bowery, especially when you grow up here, it's like, oh, the Bowery is where the bums are. And indeed, they were. Next door, which is now a kind of retooled SRO for like hipster kids, was a building that was filled with basically homeless men who were drunk, who one frequently had to walk over to get into the building. There was not, the street was nothing like it was. There were a lot of SROs. There was no art here. There was no retail here except for restaurant supply stores. There was one downstairs. It was a little bit better north of Houston Street because Phoebe's was there on 4th Street and maybe one or two other things, but it was its own outpost in that there was a lot of kind of social service needs that were unique to a drunken community of men who, it felt like the 1940s in a certain way. Across the street was heroin, because you could score Dr. Nova on Rivington Street, appropriately named, and William got, involved with heroin again in this space, and this, kind of going east, it was really junkie turf and not gentrified, and going west, it was still very Italian. So it was a kind of lost New York.
Mm-hmm. Did it feel dangerous to you living here?
No. I moved to these fields when I was 18 or 19. Oh, so as you get, and when I grew up in New York. I grew up in the Bronx in the 70s. It was not, so it's New York. People don't understand. It was a very different city.
Yeah. But. Now, when you first lived with James and William, it was in Lawrence, Kansas.
No. See, it started here. I met James in 81 at the bar. We fell in love, was it 81? Yeah, very quickly. It was a 6-year BAJD program up at CCNY, and I was like gonna transcend class by becoming a lawyer, a civil rights lawyer, and here, everything changed. I'd read William already. I'd read William in high school. I'd read Naked Lunch. Someone, like the first time I did cocaine in a hallway at the Bronx High School of Science, someone also handed me Naked Lunch and said, this guy is great. I don't know what happened to that kid. He kind of fell off the radar. So I was familiar with the work and thought it was kind of great and wild. And I woke up here one morning, I think it was in the spring of '81, and this was a bedroom, there was a closet over there, the orgone collector was in there. I got up to pee, and the table back there, there was William having breakfast, and oh, you must be a friend of James, my name is William, and it was like, oh shit. And it was very, it happened. So yeah, like my birth in many ways is someone who was paying more attention to literary culture happened here because I was 19 when I moved out to Kansas. And I was there for a couple of years, and William was like handing me books, Celine, and it was kind of a very...
I'd love to hear anything you have to say about your early years in Kansas, and William as a teacher.
William was a really sweet man. That's the thing. There was a very crusty reputation, and people were scared of him. But he was a very docile person. He was a very hurt person. That what all of that veneer was hiding was someone who was not particularly happy with life and who had been hurt in life, and the work is all about a certain pain, and the pain of having murdered his wife and watching his son die. Cursed at birth is what he said about his son, Billy Jr., but in many ways William's curse of the kind of American capitalist Midwestern family is there's a great picture of him in front of the Burroughs building. Someone in the family created the adding machine, and there's an essay collection called The Adding Machine, and he came from that stock of white America that, let's just say, they didn't help move things along in the 20th century, and what he was one of the great writers responding to the American dream, saying it's a crock of shit. And if you look at what this culture is made of, you need to flip it. And he, was one of the great post-war writers dealing with class and race and sexuality and alienation. And coming from the class that he did, I think it actually allowed the work to get out there more quickly than it would have from someone else.
Amazing. There's a very, I think, interesting kind of transition with the perception of William Burroughs happening in maybe the 80s, where he went from being revered by a smallish group of people to being on Saturday Night Live, to be in movies, to almost becoming a certain kind of persona.
The godfather of punk was one of the terms that was used. The influence, whether it was in music or in film, the memes, for lack of a better term, the routines that were kind of perpetuated. Naked Lunch, just as a novel, Naked Lunch is really important because it's not a novel, because it's made up of these routines that are comical, that are social satire. So he was funny. The work may be grotesque in the eyes of some people, but it is filled with a kind of black humor that is Swiftian more than anything else. And that work, the early work, was like, it really turned a lot of people on. And there was a lot of activity down here. Victor Bockrus, a journalist, was bringing a lot of people through to meet William to create.
Talk about the dinners that Victor Bockrus.
That was before me. I came at the tail end of that, but
I think the audience may not know about that.
There were a lot of people there's that table there, a big table that hosted many dinners. And whether it was, I wasn't around for like the Rolling Stone stuff, but it was, in my day it was Chris Stein and Debbie Harry or Patti Smith, or Patti was still in Detroit, but I think it had come through. It was very rock and roll, very downtown. It was a moment when punk and new wave was kind of getting picked up by record labels. So people who were in local bands were getting famous, whether it was Richard Hell or Tom Verlaine. There was a sense of, there's a lot of activity downtown. That the Mud Club was this rich environment where painters and artists and writers were coming together. Bomb magazine started down the street 44 years ago. There was a lot of cultural activity, and the rents were cheap. So here's this guy, the guy who comes back from he finally kicks drugs in England, the famous junkie comes back, and there was a kind of panache around him. So I got here in '81, and I think that was the year he was on Saturday Night Live. And it was Lauren Hutton's doing, who, she had read the work, and she said, if you want me, I want Burroughs on. And things were moving with Giorno and Giorno Poetry Systems Records, and William and Laurie Anderson and John Giorno had done You're the Guy I Want to Share My Money With, which was a double LP that was, the beginning of a tour. It was William's Red Night tour, when the Cities of the Red Night, which was the first of a trilogy of books that were, that had been lambasted by some because they're his most readable work. And some thought it was a betrayal that he actually was doing readable work, and James was blamed for that as well. Things were happening. These people who were on the margins were getting picked up by the mainstream, and it's because there was messaging that kind of allowed people who were not feeling good about themselves to create a community. And there was a real outsider sense here, and this was, so it was the last great moment of New York City, because the rents were cheap. It was pre-Giuliani. You could be a junkie, you could be a hooker, you could be a writer, you could be whoever you wanted to be, and you could live downtown, and no one was kicking you out. And there was a social fabric, and it was like the Weimar Republic, because then AIDS kind of came in and wiped everyone out. So it was a fertile and a feudal time here.
This is a perfect point to also jump to John Giorno, and the real importance he had in disseminating voices that were not that much known previously. And I don't know how many people here know about the Dial-A-Poem projects or records, but
well, it's just relaunched.
It's an idea that
John, I think John's Dial-A-Poem project was this really genuine conceptual project. He was a sound poet. John was never well published because a lot of the work was about sound and repetition, and he was, he was kind of more of I'm not going to say performance poet, he was almost like a composer in a certain way, and misunderstood in the poetry world. But Dial-A-Poem got the voices of poets, really wonderful poets and critics and painters, reading poems out. And the extension into the record label, I've always thought it benefited John to have Giorno Poetry Systems getting his work out with people like Anne Waldman or John Ashbery and Allen Ginsberg, because it helped his own career, and there's nothing wrong with that. He just, it was like making a magazine. But he really did get a lot of voices out, and there was no, while there was no mandate, it was as inclusive as it could possibly be. And John started going into music, and he was an adventurer in his own way, but with an agenda, and that's life.
Everyone has agendas. Yeah. But I'm always struck by the Dial-A-Poem project, the democracy of it, in terms of it was open to anyone that wanted to hear these poems. And the range of people that were on it, from Jackie Curtis to John Cage to,
the list is extraordinary. Yeah.
Why don't you?
That's also before me. I picked up on that later and more actually since Giorno Poetry Systems has resurrected itself. I'm now paying more attention to what he did.
Okay.
Because John moved from one thing to the next to the next. The cultural production that happened in this building via John, whether it was a record label or
talk about those moves.
John, from Dial-A-Poem to the record label to painting. John was, kind of moving from space to space to space because he was never really secure as a writer. And I published him in 1994, maybe. That was his first real book in more than 20 years. And I kind of loved his work because I loved him. He was great. But on the page, it didn't work as well as it worked when I'm not going to do my John Giorno impersonation, but it's like, I'm going to kill myself. That thing, the repetition. And he was doing beautiful work with tape loops. And the proper poetry world didn't get it. Frank O'Hara didn't do a thing for him. Nobody really did a thing for him, and he was at odds with a lot of people in the poetry world. So he created this other space that was wonderful. He had Mary Baraka on records, Jane Cortez. He was just going to people from all these different spaces and bringing them together with like Jim Carroll or David Johansen, and it was a wonderful project that actually made a difference. And he had artists like Keith Haring doing the jackets of records, and he did single records with Jim Carroll and with David Johansen when major record labels weren't taking, like they burnt out. John said, let's do it, let's see what we can get out there, and for John it was also getting Giorno Poetry Systems out there, because if he sold whatever the low number was for a record company, it was a high number. And so he was very savvy in that way, and he introduced type was very important. Like the paintings all came from a designer he worked with named Mark Michelson, who was very bold, and it was very kind of 90s. I think Mark worked at one of the magazines like Entertainment Weekly, and had a style, and it suited John because it was big. You can see some of the paintings back there, and John was big of personality and bold in presentation, but it was also, kind of like William, this very sweet. When you would sit with him, they were both kind of docile until William was generally always docile. He would just get really drunk and cantankerous. And John would get very animated when he was quite drunk. And sometimes he was, let's just say he had grudges and, axes to grind, I think.
Well, I was going to say, how did he deal with not fitting in to really the poetry scene, nor I think the art scene? It seems to me he
had famous lovers from the time he was 20 something. Jasper Johns, Robert Rauschenberg, Andy Warhol. The list would go on. So there was and he was doing that zine, Vitamin G, where he listed the dick sizes of everyone he slept with, and it'd be Rauschenberg 8.5, Burroughs 3.5, and it was a riot. And I think we published some of those in the book we did, and he didn't give a shit, but it was also funny. He was a kind of a proto-zine publisher as well. I think they were Mimeo. He came from a kind of, the family did well, but they started in Brooklyn. They went to Great Neck. He was a stockbroker. He's kind of a great character in many ways, because he's not the person you would expect to become the artist he was. And I think he was. So he wasn't devoted to one particular practice. His Buddhism he was devoted to. He was devoted to his meditation practice. But if he moved across platforms in terms of artistic production, this place was a wonderful place for him to do that, because there were people coming and going, and there were people coming and going in and out of William's life. There were people who were kind of, doing that Greek, it was an honor to come here and have dinner with William, so people would take advantage of some celebrity being around and bring them through, and things were getting better for William. Blade Runner, which was based on Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, has all these Burroughsian images in it. So Hampton Fancher came through, and Ridley Scott. Things started moving around, and William started doing more rock and roll collaborations, and William kind of liked it. He kind of.
I was going to say, how did he like becoming?
Well, he was poor. He went through the family money. When I was here, I helped to pack William up, and he left in, I guess it was late 80. What was it, 83? I think. I lose track of the years, but we packed him up, and he went to Kansas, and he was living in a stone house out in the country, and that was when things were starting to happen. I guess it was in the early 80s, because it was in 84 that Andrew Wiley walked into his life after Allen Ginsberg had been represented by Wiley, and these guys were getting these like multi-book contracts at Harper or Viking, and looking back, the money wasn't really so great, but they were getting picked up by the mainstream press, and William went out to Kansas just as all of this was happening, which was great because he was back on, he left here on methadone. He came back to New York, he got addicted again, he left on methadone. And staying out of this kind of like mosh pit of activity was good. James had already left for Kansas before William did. Because he was getting burnt out here. So William appreciated going out there and actually living well for the first time in years. Money was coming in. He moved from the country into town. There was someone that was around to cook for him. They lived better than they ever lived in New York. And William probably lived longer because he was living in Kansas and away from, the drinking continued, he was like a drunk, that guy. And the drinking got earlier every day. It's like cocktails started at 3:30 by the end. And, dinner had to be on the table by 6 or he was really cantankerous, and then he'd get really stoned and be really funny. And then you could get home sometimes by 8 o'clock, 8:30, because it was like, okay, he's down. Like, what else is there to do? And there were wonderful people who came in and out of his life, friends who had moved to Lawrence. Stephen Lowe, who a lot of people in New York know because he was here, had lived in Lawrence for a while James was elsewhere. And there was a devoted community there. So this place was kind of still here, for him to come back. I forget how it went, but John bought it. William and James basically stopped paying the rent because things were tight, and John covered it, and John eventually bought the place, but he said, you'll always have a place to stay. And indeed, William, and that's why the room is like that, because William would come home, and things might have changed around here, but during William's lifetime, he always knew that there was a place for him in New York, and John was incredible about that. And they had a beautiful relationship. John finally, I think, really resented William's fame the way he resented the fame of everyone else around him. But that's life.
He was certainly around a lot of very famous people in that constellation.
Yeah.
And that could be great, and I'm sure also very difficult.
Yeah, only much later in life did John get attention, more through painting, I think, than through any, and it's, and at the end of his life, it was a more famous partner who helped to fund the I Love John Giorno show in Paris and in New York, and John separated himself from all of those people, like us, he needed to get away from the affiliation with Burroughs. He needed to be his own man, and that happened for him later in life, and that's why we're here.
Yes.
Now, I want to ask you, you're in this space. Tell me, why? What artifacts? You're really getting into great people and things, and it's. I appreciate it because it's a lot of my people. But was it from the books? Where did this all?
Okay. Thank you.
Welcome.
I would say, I'm kind of entering a period in life where you try to have coherence and bring some shape to things that you've been, that I've been doing for decades, and I have to bring Henry James into this because he said something that I've always loved, and it was about his appreciation of the palpable, imaginable, visitable past, as if you were sitting at a table and you could reach a long arm out and touch someone at the other end of the table. And that's partly what I've been doing all of my life. I'm very interested in the generation before mine. And so the Artifacts project is an attempt to give shape to some of that and to conserve and disseminate a history that I think is extremely important. I think that you and I have come up during a very rich time, and it's really important to preserve that. And there's also this thing about time. The first two people I interviewed on video, one was Beatrice Wood, and I'm wearing her Beatrice Wood T-shirt, and the other was Virgil Thompson. So in talking about time, it was about 40 years ago that I began doing that, and they were talking about events that had happened 60 and 70 years before that. So there was this sense of, I was getting firsthand experience of Beatrice Wood being literally in bed with Mina Loy and Charles Demuth and Marcel Duchamp after the Blind Man's Ball. I was literally experiencing Virgil Thompson talking about first meeting Gertrude Stein. And I was doing a book about Four Saints and Three Acts, the Gertrude Stein opera, and I had tracked down the 1934 cast, which was an all-black cast. And I was thinking, I'm going to transcribe this and I'll add a few decorous adjectives and all of that, but it has none of the power of what I'm seeing being with them. This would make a great documentary. I know nothing about documentaries. By the time I do, they will all be dead. So at that moment, I conceived this thing, shoot people when they're alive, and then you figure out later. So in some ways, Artifacts has that impulse and that shape. Working with a really wonderful team, it's become something different. It's become, frankly, more beautiful than I expected. And Awel is one of that team, and Will, who's also shooting, is part of that. But it's taking this concept and then moving. It's a living concept. And the people that we continue to interview expands and expands. So to me, it's a wonderful shaping, organizing the most important things of my life and concerns of my life, and also continuing. And actually, in this terrible, terrible time that we're living in, trying to remind other generations that of different communities that existed.
Well, thank you.
So that's a long answer to your question.
It's why I was talking. I went to a Paris review party last night and wound up going out with a bunch of 30-somethings, and was hanging out with the queers, of course. And there is this hunger for what was lost, because there's this we've had these weird gaps in queer culture, and suddenly there's a generation gone, and just the nature of AIDS, and then AIDS drugs, and PrEP, and so many things have changed behaviorally, and the culture has not kept up with it. So there seems to be a hunger. Like there's this Juan Arovich show opening, next week, and his work, the potency there is really important. And I was with the editor of the Condé Nast Queer magazine, a wonderful young man named Ludwig, and he was asking about Dennis Cooper, and so I realized I'm 10 years younger than those guys, and they're getting to that place where they're at that iconic level, and it's projects like this that at least keep the work available in terms of the voice of the artist. So it's wonderful that you're doing that.
Well, now going directly to you, you've been in publishing in many, many ways, and I don't know if you were around for the mimeograph revolution, that may be before it, but you've seen zines, you've seen many forms of publishing, and I'm curious about the evolution of the forms, and as we become digital. Anything you want to say about?
Digital democratized so much, as zines democratize. I mean, the minute you get out of gatekeeper culture, things open up, and that is a beautiful thing. That I mean, I work with a lot. I do nonprofit consulting for small presses and literary magazines.
A lot. I mean, Ira works with everyone.
Once
Not
did.
everyone,
Yeah. I mean, there's no money anymore. Thank you, Trump administration. But in that context, I was at a conference last week in Hudson that the New York State Council on the Arts does every year in the literary arts, and people are pissing and moaning about the NEA, and it's like, excuse me, you didn't see that coming? Get over it. It's like this has been happening when I went to work there in 2011. It was so hamstrung by what had happened in the early 90s during the Wanarovich Finley, John Fleck, Holly Hughes, Fran Meyer. I mean, that agency was kind of useless. And there was, in my field, in literature, there was so little money that anyone who's pissing and moaning about what they got, you let your board get it for you. I mean, there wasn't that much money, and I was, kind of saying to people, it's like it's time for collective action all over again. And the situation with stores also, books are really expensive. And I think people need to figure out how to publish differently. Do a limited edition to sell to one crowd, and do it on newsprint to sell to another crowd, or give it away. I mean, there needs to be more collective activity just in terms of getting books out, and how publishing companies are made, and how they, just the royalty system doesn't work for a lot of reasons. It should be splits of revenues with writers. And I just think, I'm an old socialist in my way, and I don't think capitalism has worked very well for books, especially now that 40% of the whole industry is in the hands of Amazon. So I think there are great things, and they're happening already. I mean, there are a lot more independent presses, and there's a lot more happening in terms of online magazine publishing. And so marginalized communities are getting out there, and I think the whole, everyone wants to break out and break through, but give me a break. It just doesn't happen that way. Right now, the fiction list is all romantasy. Someone had to explain that to me, and I'm still kind of publishing adjacent. It's romance and fantasy combined. That's 6 out of the 10 books on the Times list. It's nuts. Or maybe it says something about the culture that people are trying to escape through love and fantasy. But I think publishing is all about making things public, and people have to work together to make that happen. And the whole reliance upon a culture that is validating through modes that are antiquated, through systems that are antiquated, it's all going to die, as many things will in this culture. And that's fine. It's great, because it means that new things will rise up again.
Yeah. Well, I just want to,
that's a side.
But I want to address briefly John Giorno as a kind of activist.
That's an interesting phrase for him, because I don't know that I would use that term, but but with AIDS, yes.
That's really where I'm going. And my ex-partner, Robert Atkins, was one of the founders of Visual AIDS, which was the art world's response to the AIDS crisis. And one of the people that contributed very much in terms of visual design was John. And I think I see in John there's a celebration, there's a sex positive.
John wasn't, I'm not going to say he wasn't afraid of death, but his training in Buddhist philosophy gave him a different perspective on what was happening and dealing with people. And the AIDS treatment project grew out of the fact that we had friends who were getting really sick and there was no treatment. And if you wanted to do experimental treatment, it cost a fortune. So running the money through a 501c3 and giving it back as a grant was a brilliant scam to help people get what they needed. And sometimes it was somebody needed a fix because they were a junkie, or someone needed to go to Switzerland because they were taking their blood out and treating it with Freon or whatever was going on. You know, and John did it. I mean, we had a friend down the block, Betsy Sussler, was when she was down living with a friend who had a great loft a few blocks down called Carl Apfelschnitt, and Carl was dying. I mean, Carl died in 1990, which is when the wave really began, and there was no cure, so we started raising money for him, and it ran through John, and he was a lover of John's at some point also. And there were a lot of people who were getting help through John just with groceries or health insurance premiums or whatever. John didn't give a shit. John is like, you need money, just like let's bring it in and let's make it happen. And there were fundraisers, and it was for people who'd write John a letter and say, I'm a junkie, I'm living down the street, I need $100 for groceries, and John would write a check and bicycle it over. So he really cared because there was no one, it was pre, corporate, like GMHC and all those things that became, like filled with Ryan White money and stopped doing their work. John just got money out and created a sense of beauty with that, because he was excited. I mean, he got a little excited about death sometimes, which freaked people out, and that, because he would be very, as we saw in the film, it's like, that was fabulous, the World Trade Center was great, and it's like, oh, take it down, John, and it did freak people out, but he reveled in life. And life and death are kind of the same thing, and it's a beginning and end. So he was wonderful, and I saw that firsthand with the AIDS treatment project. And Keith Haring got involved and helped to raise money. It was a great project, and here there was a time when the new Giorno Poetry Systems was kind of in that model, helping trans organizations and following, going to where the needs are and taking care of people.
Great. I think that's a good moment for us to stop. I think we should take a few questions. What time is it?
8:30.
8:30. Okay, so let's do 15 minutes of questions. And, it's really important that this group be able to mix with one another, because there's great people here tonight. So it shouldn't be all about you watching us.
And if you need to leave, feel free.
Yes,
it's
exactly,
okay.
exactly. So who would like to either ask a question or make an observation? I am so far seeing no one.
I just want to thank you for presenting this here in this space, and many things that awakened incredible memories. And thank you for the work you do, which is very special.
Thank you for writing.
and that's Anne Waldman.
Anne Waldman.
Anne Waldman speaking, who was very much in the center of many of these things.
But I wanted to say John had a role in the poetry project. Some of the greatest events were done, under some fantasy where he, the birthday party with the LSD punch. This is where he got what came in. I found, as director, I found myself in a pile of leaves in the yard. I have to go make an announcement. Anyway.
And every year when he would perform, he was kind of late. People went to hear John, which was great.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But and with some of the second generation or second and a half generation, there's more interest in the performative.
Well, with that sense of celebration, let's celebrate ourselves. and while there's still time, and there's I think refreshments. Is there or
There are refreshments.
there are refreshments? So
Refresh yourselves.
refresh
And
yourselves.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. That was wonderful. Yeah, that's nice.
I thought it was
great. It was lovely. And Anne said it. It's like making this space. That was really potent when you said that. It was like, yeah, the space, because it was.
And they're not changing much. I'm on the advisory board, and I just say,
I got the feeling that maybe, I mean, Anthony said something today about Hugo being difficult.